Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Chekalusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We welcome you to Book Sandwiched In. Please silence your cell phones at this time. We are live streaming today's event. The video is being broadcast directly to the library's YouTube channel. Masks are recommended but not required at the library at this time. We do have masks on the table in the back for anyone who wants one. If you are having difficulty hearing at any time during the program, please just raise your hand and we'll adjust the volume. And to access the induction loop in the auditorium, please set your hearing aid to the T switch. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. In addition to presenting in-person programs like today's BSI review, FFRPL is also proud to continue to work with the library on presenting and promoting many online programs. This year, we began partnering with the Rochester Public Library and the Library Speakers Consortium to present RPL online author talks from best-selling authors and thought leaders. Registration information is posted on our website, ffrpl.org, as well as the library's website, rockcitylibrary.org. The talks are free. You can participate and ask the author questions in real time during the online event, or you can access the archive talks at your convenience at a later time. Right now, during BSI, the library is hosting an online author talk which intersects with some of the topics we'll hear about during today's book review. So we do invite you to watch the video of that program with Kwame Christian, who's the best-selling author of How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race, online at your convenience at a later date. On December 6th, RPL will present an online author talk with Geraldine Brooks, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of March, People of the Book, and The Secret Chord, and her most recent title is Horse. Lastly, we invite you to FFRPL's Seasons Readings book sale, which will be held in this building just in front of the library store from November 28th through December 6th. We'll have many like-new books, including specialty pop-up books, as well as games, puzzles, CDs, and DVDs for your holiday shopping. Today's Book Sandwiched In review is of Under the Skin, The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation by Linda Villarosa. Villarosa's gripping human stories and meticulous research explain how racism causes people of color in the U.S. to, quote, live sicker and die quicker than their white counterparts, even though we have the most advanced medical technology in the world and spend more on health care than any other country. Our reviewer today is Dr. Linda Clark, who has been a practicing physician in the Rochester area for over 25 years and who serves as the Chief Medical Officer for Jordan Health, where she works towards equitable health outcomes for all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Clark to our podium.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you to all who are here supporting me personally and anybody online as well. I have way too many slides, so I will probably cut myself off at some point, and anybody wants the slides, just let me know. I have no problem sharing my slides. So we got a good synopsis of the book, Under the Skin. And I thought I would just kind of share some of the main points that I got from the book. Obviously not in the detail that you'll get from reading the book yourself, but I have to say that I do these kind of talks all the time. I talk a lot about medical racism, but there was something about reading this book that I felt was very emotional. Maybe it's the personal stories that were attached to every chapter that she wrote. But I think a lot of it was just so very personal, and just this stark realization that the system is designed to hurt me. That's a hard pill to swallow. But in reading this, and I've known this, and I like to show data and graphs and things like this, but I think her weaving it with our stories, really, really brings that to life, including my own experiences. So for some people, a lot of the book may be traumatic, it may be triggering, for especially Black people reading this book. So those were the chapters in the book, and I would like to talk a little from each chapter. The first one is the standard line, and there's in this chapter, she starts to clear up her own misconceptions, Linda Villarosa's own misconceptions about race and health outcomes. I think, when I was in medical school and before, a lot of the conception was that people did worse because of class issues, because they didn't have enough money, because they didn't have access to insurance. And I think a lot of the times we in medicine, and my specialty is preventive medicine and public health, along with occupational and work-related medicine. So, our goal is always to teach and preach and tell you how best to live your lives. And a lot of the times it's feeling very much like a blame game. Really, you're overweight. Why don't you just eat correctly? Why don't you just, and obviously it's way, way, way more complicated, and everybody understands that's not the case now. But the Heckler report, which was issued by Health and Human Services all the way in 1985, which doesn't feel that long ago, but anyways, they found that over 18,000 excess deaths were attributed to Black people because of heart disease and stroke. And the result of that report was more about the blame than really understanding the root of the problem. So, so we teach people, it's your personal behaviors. You can change this. You can turn this around. And Linda Villarosa, in her book, felt that very strongly in her role at Essence magazine, I believe, at the time, about getting that message to Black people to live healthier. So, one of the things she also talks about, which really touched home to me, is this kind of these integration babies. I'm an integration baby. I was born in Washington, D.C., and my parents, because, they were doing what was right, moved us out to the suburbs where we would have better education and, eventually desegregation went through that. But oftentimes you find that you're isolated. You're exceptional, right? You're not normal, you're exceptional, because you don't seem Black, you don't act like other Black people. You must be special, you must be smarter than the rest of the Black people. And that's a real burden, and it's very, very, very isolating. So not as helpful as we thought. And when we look at our local data, which I'm not here to talk about our local data, but I will, we find that a lot of people, no matter how much money they make, Black people, will still live in areas that are impoverished, as opposed to white people. As they make, first of all, they're very few, only on the order of about 20% of impoverished people live in deprived areas in our region. But when we have people who make the very most money, still almost half of Black people, when they're in the highest level of earning, will move out of poor and deprived areas. And I think there's a protective factor that's involved when you're living with people who are like you. So other lessons that she learned that are really, really important is that race is not a substitute for poverty, and vice versa. So, Dr. Harold Freeman wrote a paper called Excess Mortality in Harlem. And, and that was the beginning of starting to squish some of these myths. And the myths abound, and they're still around, and I won't go into a lot of them here, but there's, and I'll get into this in some of her subsequent chapters, this thought that black biology is somehow different, and that's why we see different outcomes. In her Lessons Learned chapter, she also introduces us to Arlene Geronimus, who talks about the weathering phenomena. And really, she's looking at how stress affects our bodies physically. How does stress translate to physical aging of our bodies? And we've noticed that a lot of her work involves black women exhibiting more of this weathering. And the interesting term about weathering is that there's, this double meaning, this double entendre, that when something is weathered, it's worn down. But there's also people that weather the storm. There's a strength in this weathering. So interestingly, as we start to get more and more information, mainstream medicine pushes back. They cannot, and to this day, we still struggle with this, accepting evidence that racism is driving disparities in health outcomes. And particularly in this chapter, she talks about infant and maternal mortality. There's a quote that I pulled out of here, and I believe I can't see. This is, "Today I am chagrined," this is Linda Villarosa talking, "to think I believe that the impact of insidious discrimination associated with lived experience of being black in America can be washed away in a bubble bath," that was a typo, "or calmed with journaling or meditation and me time." And what she was referring to is this thought that we combat this black superwoman persona with just take it easy. You just need to relax, and you'll have good outcomes. And she found that is not the case. It's also not the case that we are the people that need to solve the problem of racism in America. It's a uniquely American phenomenon born of slavery, and it takes all of America to solve the issues that have arisen as a result of enslaving people in this country. So it's not a FUBU issue for us by us, it's an all of us issue. So she then goes on to talk about this dangerous myth that black bodies are somehow different. And she alludes to that in the first chapter, but goes into greater detail in this chapter. She talks a bit about mistrust of the health system, which is something that most of us in health are looking at. I think many of us understand but don't think it's us type of thing going on. But she brings us the story of the Ralph sisters. And I'm thinking, where was I that I did not know this story? This is a big story. It was all in the paper. I was of age. I should have, but I did not know the story of these Ralph sisters who suffered forced sterilization. And in that story, the part of the way they got to them and convinced them is that these governmental people came, and they came with helpful things. They were helping with those social determinants that we talk about, and trust was a result. With that trust, they took those girls and sterilized them without proper consent, kind of a brush off. Well, yeah, they understood, and now we have two women that grew up without being able to bear children. There was a lot that resulted in terms of reproductive justice as a result of that, but nothing that those young women who are older women, received. There was no compensation, nothing as a result of that. And a lot of what happened to them had, again, roots in slavery. There was this way to just kind of justify doing whatever we wanted to do with black people, whether it's cruel punishments, whether it's experimentation. I wanted to, I'm not the one to read poetry too much, but there was a poem that I had tagged here that talks about the bodies, our bodies not being our own. And this is from Her Body is a Weapon by, I can't say her name, Umalini, and it goes like this. Her body is a weapon, covered with thorns. Her body is a weapon, numb. She feels pain no more. You see, no one ever told her that she was beautiful. No one ever told her that she looked like a queen. All they did was demean. Her body is a weapon, bleak, cold, and forlorn, using her thighs as ammunition, fighting a battle only pain could conceive, wet red blood dripping in between her legs, ruptured-souled that she is. And they ask her to be brave. They ask her to believe that she's beautiful when the ones who create her are the ones who enslave, puncture her soul, rupture her body, massacre her core. So that speaks a lot of violence. And, racial violence has its roots in slavery in our country, as I mentioned before. The whole purpose of the institution, as I'm sure many of you are people who read books and come out to talk about them at noon, understand that, the whole purpose of the institution was to generate wealth for white institutions and people. And this lie that started, that grew, was solely to serve the purpose of continuing to do that. So this lie that they put out that black people can withstand enormous amounts of pain, provided the rationalization for cruel aspects of slavery. So, backbreaking, unpaid labor, squalid living conditions, brutal punishments. And unfortunately, this tiptoed into the realm of quote-unquote science. And we see very early this misuse of black people for the advancement of science, and I have some examples here, and I'll just hone in on one since I know we don't have a lot of time today. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, because that touches me a lot, because in my field I do a lot of measuring of your pulmonary capacity, how healthy your lungs are. And he presented himself as a specialist in Negro diseases and peculiarities, and he was made the early precursor to our current spirometer that measures lung function. And so he created this test, which if you've ever had one, it takes a whole lot of, you have to be driven to get a good test, right? It's something you need to be coached through. It's not as precise as taking somebody's blood and measuring something in the blood. But he came to the conclusion that black people not only had less of a lung capacity than white people, but the way to improve that was through torture, is the best way to say it, is through beating them in slavery. And that apparently was logical, to a lot of these doctors who were indeed slave owners themselves. And to this day, when I use my spirometer, I can't interpret a result unless I put somebody's race in, and it's corrected to be, whether, Now, any of you who've been to an autopsy lately know that you can't tell anybody's lungs when you open up their bodies, whether they're white or black. But that is an example of something that persists in our country. So, the other thing, getting back to the Ralph sisters, was this, basically we had an organized eugenics program in the United States. This theory, kind of Nazi thinking that if you get the genetic pool just right, then you'll see this improvement of people. So they did this through sterilization to keep people from reproducing who they didn't feel were as fit. And it was quite organized, and it's just, to me, it's mind-boggling. This is, I don't know how old you are. I don't want to make suppositions, but I know I was old enough throughout all of this to have lived during times when the government was sanctioning sterilization in many populations. So I know we don't have time to go through a lot of that, but I know a lot of people talk about what happened in Puerto Rico. That one seems to be very, very common. You know, over 37% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized between the 30s and the 70s. 37%. And you know, and this is why I get tearful, you know, when preparing this and talking about this, because it's very personal. So North Carolina, and I'm going to take questions at the end if you don't mind. North Carolina doctors performed 7,600, and mostly black women, sterilizations between 1933 and 1974. And their theory was, well, we'll keep the welfare rolls low, we'll reduce poverty, and improve the gene pool. So the next chapter, she goes into unequal treatment. And I tell you, when that book came out, I ran to, I didn't run to the bookstore, wasn't there, but I ran to order it. And I was like, yeah, we finally got this book that shows and proves these disparities that everybody knows about that exist based on race. And so it did do that, but the consequences weren't as intended. The consequences weren't as positive, I'll say, in terms of remedying the situation. So, you know, one of the things that we look at in this chapter on unequal treatment is maternal outcomes. And I have a picture later of Serena Williams, because I know many of you know her story. She almost lost her life delivering a baby in this country. So, you know, we know, and the statistics are slightly different here, but I'm going with the book because I'm supposed to be reviewing the book. Black women were 3 to 4 times more likely to die, and black infants twice as likely to die compared with white moms and infants. I'll just slide this out there. It's like 3 times in our region for infant mortality, okay? So why are the disparities greatest when moms are at the upper levels of education? Why is that? When I had my first child, I had to go to a different hospital than I had originally planned to because he was not progressing. Labor was not progressing, and I had to go in. And one of the first questions I got was more of an astonishing statement. You have insurance? I'm like, yeah, I do. And the next thing, you know, filling out the stuff, you work? I'm like, yeah, I do. And I was a physician at the time, you know. And so, but when I walked in there, I was like any other black woman that walked into Children's Hospital in Buffalo at the time. And just these basic suppositions changed the way I was going to be treated, you know, from then on. So I don't know what else to call it except racism. So that's the word I'm going to be using today, and I'm going to be unashamed about using that because it's racism. Intentional or not, the effects are the same. Racism is the structural issue that's yielding the poor outcomes that we have with our moms. So when we go to that book, Unequal Treatment, they very tenderly tiptoe around physicians and healthcare providers, and but they basically say, hey, you know, sometimes bias is there, unconscious or not, and you know, and we really need to think about that. Oh, I'm gonna slide off here. Okay, sorry. But in unequal treatment, they call out very specifically the fact that oftentimes black people don't have life-saving treatments. We're more likely to get a limb amputated than getting bypass surgeries to the legs and feet to preserve. We're more likely to have poor cardiac outcomes. So this is actually not from the book, but Kevin Schulman wrote a paper, The Effect of Race and Sex on Physicians' Recommendations for Cardiac Catheterization. And oh boy, were the physicians ticked, because they're like, no way that, you know, something I'm doing is causing these disparities, which were quite significant. You know, whereas we see black people with higher instances of high blood pressure and heart disease, we were less likely to get those expensive procedures like cardiac catheterization. And, the backlash from physicians was very real. And, we saw that again with the book Unequal Treatment. Now, this was, I have it on my shelf. I was like, this is going to be the game changer, right? We finally have proof of what we know, and it didn't change a whole lot, despite the fact that it was mostly white scientists and educators getting around the table and looking at this evidence. It didn't matter because physicians cannot be racist. So, I do have my picture of Serena Williams. There's something bad for babies and moms who are black in this country, and I'm not gonna spend too long. I know I have way too many slides. One of the things that we have found is that it is definitely not protective going from a place that's impoverished to the United States, where we're supposed to have the best health care ever for black women. So if I had my baby in an impoverished part of the Caribbean, my baby was more likely to have a better birth weight than if I had it right here. Okay? My own children, neither one of them were 7 pounds. They didn't meet the definition of low birth weight. But certainly I looked at my white friends, oh, this is my 8-pound baby, and I'm like, whoa. I was 5 pounds and change, when I was born. There's something about being here that changes our outcomes that has nothing to do with how much money you make. So stress, the theory is, the stress is causing physical changes that impact our babies, our overall health. And it's really, I thought it was just fascinating to read in this book about the Black Women's Health Study, which is a really, really large cohort study of black women that they follow over time. Now, they'd had the Nurses' Health Study, which was, they found basically white women. And they're like, we should do this where we capture what happens to black women. And I'm actually in that I don't know, is anybody else in that study? I'm in that study. And we get our little updates, and every year I fill out my survey, and one year I had to send, some cheek samples and other things. So it's been very important. And one of the things they did introduce was the concept of being able to measure disrespect and racist behaviors, because people are like, oh, there's no way to quantify it. Well, yeah. David Williams figured out a way to define race-based, race-related insults, which I'm sure any black person can tell you, yep, there's at least half of these things on this list on the right side have happened to me. The Black Women's Health Study added an 8th criteria as well. But, as I just described, walking in and people making assumptions, walking into a store and people following you around, people acting like they're afraid of you, crossing the other side of the street, all these things I'm sure many of us have experienced. But this was their way to quantify it, study it, and see what kind of outcomes happens with people who experience more of these rather than those who have less. So we know that your degree, your pedigree does not give you a free pass. We've learned that, we've established that, and I'm going to keep on moving. So we also know where you live matters. And so here's another reason I started to cry when I put this together, because this is a picture of my mother. This is my mom, and she died when she was 71. But I always think, when I look at this picture of her on the banks of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., with the Pepco smokestacks behind her, and I think of this weird, I'm a physician, I don't know why she's dead to this day. I don't fully understand my aunt and why she is dead to this day. And now my uncle just passed a couple months ago from an idiopathic pulmonary condition, which we say, oh, we don't know why that happened. But do we know why that happened? What insults did they have in their years growing up in these communities, which they call fence line communities, that are near places that spew toxic substances? This is before, 1965. This is before, EPA and OSHA and all these things. But even now, black people are more likely to live in communities that have poor access to health care, not as nice outdoor space, clean air issues, public transportation being the only place, way they can get to work, and having affordable, healthy food. We see it right here in Rochester every single day. And so blacks are exposed to over 1.5 times more of that sooty pollution that probably came from those Pepco stacks that come from burning fossil fuels. So lung disease, heart disease, and premature death can occur with those types of exposures. We have disproportionate climate impact. This is a picture with in New Orleans of Hurricane Katrina. Who are the faces that you see when we have these disasters? It's often people of color. This was a fascinating story about Warren County, North Carolina, which once again I didn't know. But it was a great story about environmental justice, and I'll let you read the story in the book. But hint, a New York company came down to North Carolina, dumped their toxic stuff in North Carolina, and they decided, oh, we got a place we're gonna to properly dispose of it right in the black community. And so the story of this, and the I forgot which church, United Church of Christ, and kind of the story about environmental justice, which we often don't think about, but very much disproportionately, these things disproportionately impact poor people and black people in our country. So my next sets of slides I'm going to kind of run through, and I'll summarize about the mental health stressors of being black in America. I think most of you have probably read, and I can talk about the local data again, about poverty being a big driver for mental health outcomes in America, but then add on the issue of racism to people that are disproportionately poor. The thing is, though, traditionally, we're not supposed to express it. We're supposed to be stronger. You've got this myth of the strong black woman. You suck it up. You don't get stigmatized by saying there's something mentally wrong with you. So we have mental health issues, and we disproportionately lay the burden for violence on people who have mental health issues. So you can imagine being a black man in America who your people are already afraid of, already worried that there's going to be some repercussion to just me walking down the street with a hoodie on, and add an emotional problem or mental illness to that. It's very hard to come out and say you have a problem. So, as I mentioned, this perception of mentally ill people as violent is just not borne out in truth. So oftentimes people suffer in silence. And, so people act like, well, those are, and you get these images of these kind of antebellum movies with the happy Negroes in the field, and that is not the case. So oftentimes we're disproportionately impacted by mental health issues and don't get the care that we need. And I will keep going because I have very little time left. And you see Dr. Samuel Cartwright's name comes up again as our Negro specialist who discovered drapetomania, which was this tendency to want to run away from being enslaved, and that was an illness that can only be solved by severe beating and further enslavement. But this thinking persists today, and that's why, politically, I wish I had more time, but politically, we've made it so that black men appear to be more violent. They're more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than other people, and they criminalize schizophrenia and other mental illnesses because of that need to have black men perceived as being violent and needing to be controlled. Black men are 4 times as likely than white men to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and underdiagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorders and mood disorders like depression. So the intersection, again, of race and masculinity in this case makes the outcomes much, much worse. So I am going to stop early, and I'll just maybe have one sentence about the remaining chapters. She did write a chapter that talked about discrimination and ill treatment being able to harm anybody. So I think that's worth talking about, because I think we have a tendency in our country to stratify our the people around us and apply poor treatment. So in the case of Appalachia, there may not be black people there, but they're poor people. And they're suffering weathering and problems with substance use, as we've read, in a way that's disproportionate to the rest of our country. So solutions. Community health workers, we're seeing more of them. And people who are on the ground, who truly understand and can relate to people in our communities and can advocate. When we redesign care, we have to have patients at the table. We can't do it without us, and we can't do it without clinicians and all different types of healthcare workers. We have to have a representative workforce. How many of you have a black doctor? Yay! Okay, so that's three. That's three out of our room, right? And how often, and so it's important for white people to have black doctors too. So, absolutely. And in her book, she talks about some of the studies that have shown that outcomes can be better when you have a concordant relationship with your provider. She suggested that training needs to occur. We talked about that backlash of doctors when they hear about being racist. We need to have better, training to understand our unconscious biases and how we can deal with those. And this is my personal favorite. We have to abandon race correction in medicine. It has no place. There is no biology to race, so that really just has absolutely no place. Her epilogue talks about COVID, and that COVID really brought it all together, and gave lots of examples of what's wrong with our health system and what's wrong with racism in medicine. I'm going to read just one thing, and then I'm going to be done. When Linda Villarosa asks whether there's hope, are we getting better? Are there things changing? She said that she asked the activist and author Audre Lorde, and she said that when she asked Audre if she thought racism was dying out in our country, she suggested that I was being overly optimistic and warned me that when something dies, it doesn't just fade away. It fights to the death, desperately clinging to life, and goes out ugly. Bias and discrimination in medicine and resistance to believing that they are real may be receding, but they seem to be going out ugly. Thanks. Okay. And